Well, I think I just identified a Jane Doe. I mean, not quite. Obviously, I do not have the experience, the professional experience, nor the education to be claiming I've identified Jane Does. However, in the process of working on a very long written piece I've recently done that focused on mysterious disappearances, unsolved murders, things of that nature, which can include Jane Does, focused in the kind of southern Willamette Valley. As I did my research, I stumbled onto something completely by chance, and I think that I stumbled onto somebody who you could definitely make a case might be a Jane Doe that was discovered in California in 1979. So to get things going, on July 2nd, 1979, the almost complete skeletal remains of a deceased female were found in a steep ravine in the vicinity of Santa Rosa, California. And once they were found, it was discovered that they had been there for likely several years. Based on the information I found, they had been there 3 to 7 years, which put the time that the victim was killed between roughly midsummer 1972 and midsummer 1976. And this victim, from about the moment she was found, is believed to be one of several victims who were killed by what authorities believe is the same individual, often referred to generally as the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker killer. I'm sure this unidentified killer goes under numerous names, but during the early 70s, primarily between 1972 and 1974, several women, most of which were hitchhiking, many of whom were very young, a lot of them were teenagers, a couple were in their 20s, were discovered dead in the vicinity around Santa Rosa, and a lot of them lived in that area. There were a couple, though, that were from elsewhere and just happened to end up in that vicinity. Now, another reason that it's believed that this victim that was found in because again, 1979, and all these other victims are being killed in the earlier 70s, well, again, this victim was believed to have been there for a couple years. And the specific location where the remains of this Jane Doe were found were determined to have been roughly 100 yards from where a teenage girl named Lori Cursa was also found, and she is also believed to be a victim of this same serial killer. So the fact that these two were found so close to each other in the exact same general area only added to the belief that these two were killed by the same individual. And if all these victims were killed by the same person, there was another instance where there were 2 victims that went missing, and then about a year later, another victim went missing, and when that later victim was found, she had been left in the exact same spot where those 2 previous victims had been left. So it seems like it may have been a frequent thing that this killer did, that they would kill someone, put them somewhere, and then a little bit further on down the line would kill someone else and then leave them in the same area. For whatever reason, they like to go back and forth, reuse areas, wanted to make the authorities convinced that they were responsible, you know, that they were killed by the same person. Obviously, I can't say for 100% certain what the motive was of this killer. But again, this 1979 Jane Doe is believed to be a victim of that serial killer. Now that takes me to another situation. Obviously, I said I think I have a pretty strong case for who this Jane Doe might be. I will never, even though I started the video that way, I will never say for an absolute certainty that this is that individual. I just think there's a very strong possibility in this case. And what is interesting is this particular chapter that I was writing in this lengthy piece I've been working on, I was focusing a lot on hitchhikers, because the main story I was going to discuss is about hitchhiking situation that went wrong. And I was going to briefly address another missing person case that I didn't want to give a full chapter to because there's just not enough information out there about her. But it's somebody that pretty much anybody that's looked into it is pretty convinced that this individual, when she was last seen, she had left to go hitchhike, to go somewhere else. We don't know exactly where, but that is what has been believed. So I was going to reference that case in this chapter, but I also wanted to discuss other instances where people were hitchhiking and being killed by serial killers during the 1970s. And that was where I found myself wanting to reference this Santa Rosa serial killer who appeared to be focusing on hitchhikers. So I had no idea, while referencing both this killer and their victims and this one small Oregon case that I was going to write about in my book, that I would eventually think there was a connection between the two. And this brings me to a 16-year-old girl named Deborah Lee Tomlinson, who on October 15th, 1973, she left her home in Creswell, Oregon, which is a tiny town just a little south of Eugene. This was actually Deborah's 16th birthday, because apparently her birth date was October 15th, 1957. So, as it is said in in fact, I'll pull it up right now, because this is literally the only information you will find about the Deborah Lee Tomlinson case. I'm taking this specifically from the Charlie Project, because this is pretty much what you see everywhere else. Deborah disappeared from Creswell, Oregon on October 15th, 1973, her 16th birthday. She ran away from her home with a teenage female friend and has never been heard from again. Few details are available in her case. That's about all there is that's known about Deborah Lee Tomlinson in terms of her disappearance. So you might be saying, well, how the heck do you think that this is connected to that? Well, I'll lay that out for you. Again, just presenting my case, saying there's a lot of intriguing factors here. First of all, Deborah Lee Tomlinson's never been seen or heard from again. So obviously, she probably met with some semblance of foul play, probably not too long after she was last seen. So I believe she was killed by somebody. And when you're killed, you get left somewhere. She's somewhere out there in the world. And here was my process of how I got from this little Creswell case to Santa Rosa and this serial killer. You know, when you have so little information available about a case like this, all you know is that this 16-year-old girl ran away from home. And what's interesting is it says that she left with a friend of hers. And the inference is that they were both going to run away together. But the friend she was with, I've never seen that friend identified. I've never seen if that friend was ever found, if that friend successfully ran away and was identified later. Like, there's no information about this friend that she left with, and yet we know Deborah Lee Tomlinson by name as one of these two girls that ran away from Creswell. My first thought was they probably stuck their thumb out and decided to hit. They wanted to run away, and Creswell's really small. You're not going to run away and stay in that town. Now, it's possible if Deborah chose to hitchhike, she may have hitchhiked north to Eugene. It's the next closest, like, large town. And Interstate 5, that runs pretty much from the Washington-Canada border all the way to the Washington border with Canada, down to the California-Mexico border. I-5 runs right through Eugene and right by Creswell. And for some reason, when I saw this story, my mind told me that Deborah stuck her thumb out and started hitchhiking south towards California. Don't ask me why my mind went in that direction. I don't really know for certain. I just thought she's going to head south and maybe into California. That just is where my mind went. And so I decided, okay, I'm just going to try to dig into pretty much the succession of states kind of in the western United States. Pretty much from like Colorado to the West Coast. And I'm going to go through whatever Jane Doe cases I could find to see if maybe there's something close. And I didn't really think I was going to get that close. I thought maybe I'll find someone that matches kind of just enough that I might mention it. Like, oh, maybe this is her, but somehow I doubt it. And I only found really 2 instances that I felt could have been Deborah Lee Tomlinson. And one of them was a girl whose remains were found, I believe, in 1982 near Scottsdale, Arizona. And the only reason I felt that Deborah could have possibly been that victim is because practically nothing was known about this victim. They couldn't decipher how old she was. They couldn't determine how long she'd been dead. So it was almost by default that she became a possibility. But I never really seriously thought that she was that victim. And then I stumbled onto a random Jane Doe case from California in 1979, and that caught my attention. And then a little later on, while I'm writing, and I'm writing about the Santa Rosa serial killer, and I'm like, oh, one of the believed victims was a Jane Doe, and then all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, I ended up pulling up the same information that I pulled up looking up stuff for Deborah Lee Tomlinson like a couple days earlier, and I realized, oh, this Jane Doe related to the Santa Rosa serial killers, the same Jane Doe I randomly thought, maybe Deborah can, maybe there's a tie-in here. And that was how I initially connected the 2 together. And here is really, this is pretty much all the information that's available in both instances in terms of the individuals, what they looked like, when they went missing, and all of that. And I made a little... I threw the information together because when you have 2 instances like this, you have a Jane Doe case with limited information and you have a missing persons case with practically no information, the more correlations you find between the 2, the more, kind of surprising it would be if they weren't the same people. So here is specifically the correlations I found between these 2 victims that make me think these might be one and the same. Who knows for certain? All right. First of all, again, referencing the time in which the Jane Doe was killed and the time in which Deborah Lee Tomlinson was likely killed if she died not too long after she was last seen alive. Again, the Jane Doe was deemed to have been dead 3 to 7 years when she was found, which means she was believed to have died somewhere between the summer of 1972 and the summer of 1976. And Deborah Lee Tomlinson was last seen October 15th, 1973. So she fits into that dynamic. And, if she made it, obviously, if she's the victim, she managed to hitch down to California and somehow managed to get to that area kind of near, a little bit north of the Bay Area. And she died somewhere in there. The 1979 Jane Doe was deemed to be approximately 16 to 21 years of age. And Deborah Lee Tomlinson had just turned 16. And they were both described as being of medium build. Not super bone thin, but not super built either. Just medium build, about the most general description you can give for anyone's bodily structure. They were both Caucasian. And there was even a sketch, and it's on the Doe Network for that Jane Doe. Someone made out a sketch of, again, it was only skeletal remains that were found, so you can get a pretty good vibe for what the person looked like, but it can't be quite 100%. And if you compare that sketch with one of the last known pictures of Deborah Lee Tomlinson before she disappeared, I can't speak for you, but I definitely see correlations between the 2, especially since one of them is a sketch and it's not, an absolute perfect representation of the victim. The only real difference I see between the 2 is the hair. And again, the hair in the sketch is another thing that's approximated. The sketch, her hair's kind of, a little, it's wavy, but it's much more wavy than Deborah's hair was. But again, that's an approximation as to what her hair may have been like and probably was like. And in terms of the hair, the 1979 Jane Doe was described as having brown to auburn hair. Again, they had to kind of approximate it. They couldn't say it's absolutely brown or absolutely auburn, but it may have been a combination of the 2. And when I went back and looked at the picture of Deborah Lee Tomlinson, and under her information, it says she had brown hair. And, you know, of course, it could just be the lighting. But I noticed in that one picture of her that, especially kind of down through here, again, it could be the lighting just making the brown hair look different, but it almost looks like she has kind of a darkish, reddish auburn tint to her hair. But even if that's just, you know, an artifact of the photograph taken of her, they both still pretty much had brown hair, as it were. And honestly, the greatest distinction, the only thing I noticed where there was a real clear distinction between the two was their heights. The Jane Doe was said to be 5'3" tall. Deborah Lee Tomlinson was 5'5". Now that's, you know, not much. However, and it says so in the information available about the Jane Doe, that 5'3" figure is an estimation because they didn't recover a full skeleton. They recovered most of a skeleton, but they didn't recover a full skeleton. So 5'3" is kind of where they were ballparking it. So could she have been 5'5"? Was she 5'4.5"? And Deborah Lee Tomlinson was really 5'4.5", but said she's 5'5". Everybody rounds their height up. I'm 5'8 3/4". I have always said I'm 5'9". And again, we don't really know exactly where the figures for these individuals come from. And when it comes to weight, that information has been unavailable in relation to the Jane Doe. So there's not really anything to compare. But I mean, there you have multiple factors that sync up between these two individuals. And the greatest distinctions between them are things that are approximated and not even set in stone. The elements that are set in stone, both individuals match, and in some cases match almost perfectly. Now again, the devil's advocate argument to that could be, well, I mean, how just on the West Coast, just in California, just near the Bay Area, how many, you know, late teen-aged girls with brownish, potentially with a hint of auburn, you know, hair were walking around? Hundreds, thousands. So, I mean, there's obviously the possibility that numerous other people could potentially be this Jane Doe. I just wanted to put this argument forward. And I know that a lot of people, especially in online forums where the focus is to look into Jane Doe cases, or Jane or John Doe cases, and, you know, they'll just dig through all the records and try to find people that kind of match, which is really good. You're kind of trying, you're creating something to go off of, and you're trying to narrow the gap. But a lot of people that find that information, they'll kind of just put it up there like, what about this? This looks interesting. And a few people might comment, and then it kind of doesn't really go anywhere. So I wanted to actually take the time to sit down here and go through these multiple reasons why I feel Deborah Lee Tomlinson, who disappeared in 1973, I think is a fairly strong candidate to have been this 1979 Jane Doe, who again likely was killed sometime between 1972, really 1972 and 1974, even though they said it could have been as recently as 1976. And that is primarily because if this was a victim of that specific serial killer, the only time that we really know for certain that this killer was killing was between 72 and 74. There's a couple cases that predate 1972 that involve victims that people theorize might have been killed by that killer, but 72 to 74 is the primary period when it seems this guy was killing, and Deborah Lee Tomlinson disappears in late 1973, right in that well-bracketed period of time. So I think she's a really strong possibility. And in terms of who this serial killer is, I really don't feel there's been a lot of strong suggestions. There's one that I find very interesting. And I forget the guy's name off the top of my head. But Ted Bundy's been brought up as a possibility. But I think for at least some of the murders, he was known to have been elsewhere. The Zodiac Killer has come up as a possibility. These victims were being killed just a couple years after he was known to be killing, even though he took credit for a lot of other murders later on. And Santa Rosa is just a little bit north of the Bay Area, so it would have been right in the Zodiac Killer's vicinity. And then in relation to that, I guess for a brief period of time, it was thought that maybe the Hillside Stranglers, which were two cousins, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, who in the late 70s, 1977 and 78 mostly, abducted women, tortured them horribly, and they would usually leave their dead bodies on hillsides up in the, hills in Los Angeles, hence where they got their name. But Kenneth Bianchi lived in New York, and he didn't even come to Los Angeles to even be associating with his cousin till 1976. And again, they mostly operated out of LA, so I don't really think there's anything there to suggest they were responsible. But while hearkening back to the Zodiac, people have contemplated whether a guy named Arthur Lee Allen may have been this hitchhiking killer. And of course, Arthur Lee Allen is one of the prime names that comes up whenever you talk about the Zodiac Killer. But he did have a, I believe it was in a mobile home park. He had a place in Santa Rosa, and he was, for a brief time, attending college near there. So he was in the vicinity when these victims were killed. But the suspect I found the most interest in, because he wasn't just some big serial killer name that you could try to throw at a case, was a guy, and I forget his name. If I remember, I'll put his name right here. And this guy was a professor at Santa Rosa. I can't remember. Was it just called Santa Rosa Community College? There was a college in Santa Rosa, and this guy was a professor there. And he died in a car accident, I believe, in 1976. And after he died, when his, home was being gone through and his possessions were being put together, they found some very sexually charged artist renderings of another girl who specifically was another one of these victims of that hitchhiking killer. So why was this professor who lived in the area making creepy drawings of a young girl who happened to turn up dead amongst all these other girls? Maybe there's something there. Maybe that guy was the killer. But he's been dead since the 70s, so unfortunately, any further digging into this guy is going to have to be done without bringing him in, interrogating him, trying to make him trip up on anything. But whoever that serial killer is remains unidentified to this day. But I definitely think, and I would see the Deborah Lee Tomlinson name pop up a lot when I would be trying to go through information for the mystery murder series that I do on my channel. And, I'd always kind of pass over her because there was so little information available. Again, it's the reason I didn't dedicate like a full chapter in the piece I'm currently working on to her, because there's just not enough information. Little did I realize that I would find this correlation here. So I really do think there's a strong possibility that she was that victim. And if I click on it for a second, apparently, according to the Doe Network, dental records for the Jane Doe are available, as well as DNA. I don't know if those are available for Deborah Lee Tomlinson, especially the DNA. But again, with what they can do nowadays, they've managed to identify people based on getting DNA from close relatives. So if a close relative of hers could ever be found and provide DNA, and that could be tested against this Jane Doe, we'd probably know for certain whether she is or isn't this murder victim that wasn't found till many years after she vanished. So that's, that's going to be the one way that if it ever is found out, that's going to be how it happens. But I think it's a strong case. So I just I stumbled onto that while I was writing, and I thought that's definitely something I would like to mention and talk about here on my channel. So I wanted to bring that to you here. So all that said, I'd like to thank you so much for stopping by. As always, if you're new to the channel or haven't gotten around to it, you like what you see on my channel, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that yet. All those little things help me out. I also have a Patreon in relation to this channel. If you want to help me out there, that would be fantastic. Thank you in advance. The link to that is in the description with this video, as well as the links to my Instagram, Facebook, my Reddit subreddit, which I horribly neglect, and my TikTok as well, which I also kind of neglect. Anyway, thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Till next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian.